Hi, my name is Gabrielle, and you're listening to Glue, a podcast series of interviews and reflections on theology and faith. I call this conversational Christianity, in which we'll talk about God, we'll talk about how we talk about God, and we might even talk to God. This podcast series is part of my senior project at the College of the Atlantic, where I'm finishing out my 4 years of marine mammal studies with a podcast in theology. If you can't tell, I'm using this as an excuse to dive into spiritual questions and to better understand what makes Christianity Christianity. Today's interview is with Pastor Rob Benson, who is not only a pastor, he's my pastor, the pastor of the Bar Harbor Congregational Church in Maine. We start out by talking about some of the history of the church and how our church in particular got its name. While we are a congregational church, we're also members of the United Church of Christ. So what are these groups?
The United Church of Christ was formed in 1956 when 4 different denominations that each have really kind of innocuous names all joined together. So one of them was the Congregational Church. And I always, like, anybody who's been to New England, it's like the proverbial church, white church on the green, like literally ours, you know. But if you go to other towns in New England, like Vermont or, small towns, like there's a village green and there's a white church on it. Like, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's more cliche than I even realized. So generally those are congregational churches, largely New England based. Like that was, historical from super long time ago. Then the second little stream was, they call it the Christian church. Now that's, that was actually a denomination. That would be, I don't know quite where the geographical distribution is, but I've heard of that a bit in the South, like in North Carolina kind of thing. And then there was the evangelical strain and then the Reformed strain. So, and those would be more in like Pennsylvania, Mid-Atlantic. So, and somewhat in the Midwest too. So like at some point, the congregational and the Christian churches were kind of together, and the evangelical and Reformed churches were together. And so then they all got together. But that's, so our it's Bar Harbor Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, identifies that stream and the togetherness. I served a church for a summer in Baltimore that was First United Evangelical United Church of Christ. Like super united, right? So yeah, with all these mergers, I think some of the names got a little weird. But,
neat.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so there is both a geographic kind of, dotted line in there, and evangelical and Reformed, those two had a big like German influence too. So sometimes there's like an ethnic or national kind of heritage identity with the church, with those kind of interminglings too.
Okay, interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
How did you choose UCC?
Oh yeah. I grew up Presbyterian and Methodist in Virginia, pretty much. I went to college in Massachusetts, and I was in a super small town in Massachusetts. There was basically like a couple of campus ministries, kind of, and then there was like an American Baptist and a Congregational church, and like some of the people who were involved in some of the campus ministries were going to the American Baptist church, so I'd go there for a little while. It's really kind of more after, this is going to sound really strange, after I graduated from seminary, and I was like, okay, I'm going to get real about going to church. There was a church in the town where I was working. I was working at a boarding school, and the church that was like down the hill from where I was working was a UCC church. So I started going there, and I really loved it. And I think the two things that stand out to me were the preaching, the ministers. They were husband and wife. They were co-pastors. They were really, really good preachers. I've enjoyed that, and I loved the singing. Like they really, as a congregation, loved to sing, and music's really important to me. So that really was. I mean, there was a UCC church in my college town, but it kind of felt like the church where all the professors went. So as a student, I didn't really I mean, it would have been fine, but like that was not my scene kind of. And it also felt really academic, like more lecture than sermon kind of. So I mean, I don't know. I was looking around quite a bit in college or adrift a little bit maybe, but that's where I kind of found the UCC in my adulthood. And in that church in Massachusetts, the UCC one, that's where I started my ordination process. But because it's a highly regional process, when we moved down to DC, I had to restart it down there. So yeah.
Oh, cool. How did you decide that you didn't want to just be a Christian going to church, but you wanted to be a pastor?
Mm. Um, I did things kind of really backwards. Um, I mean, I'd say there's like a bunch of nibbles and then kind of a fairly confirming experience, a set of experiences. Um, so through my involvement in college, I got to know the college chaplain pretty well, and she was always really encouraging and really kind of real, with her faith journey. Um, During senior week, like we had the gap between when classes ended and when exams started. They call it senior week. She was going to go down and visit her mentor at the divinity school where she had gone, and she's like, "You want to come along?" I'm like, "Okay, sure." So we drove down for the day and then came back, and she introduced me to her mentor, who became my mentor, or faculty advisor or whatever. So that was a little bit of a planting of the seed, and I had already been looking through, and this is back in the day when they had paper catalogs to look through classes and things. I had picked up a catalog of courses, and I was like, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." And I was a philosophy major with essentially a minor in the history of religious thought. So it was kind of academic and personal kind of together. Um, right after college, I was a teacher and swim coach and dorm parent at a private school. And as part of all that, I was realizing I was doing like a ton of kind of informal counseling, and I'd never really had any training in that, so I thought it might be wise. So I kind of knew I was going to divinity school. I applied my first year teaching, and then I deferred a year to have another year of teaching because I loved it so much. But partly it was a mixture of like academic interest in theology. Partly I kind of had this sense that probably I was going to do something in the ministry. It was just kind of relatively big. And partly I wanted some training in counseling. So the big question was, what program? They have a 2-year program, which is a Master of Arts in Religion, and a 3-year Masters of Divinity. And the difference really was that Master of Divinity had as part of it vocational preparation. Like you had to take preaching classes, you had to do counseling, which I was already doing, right? And the Master of Arts in Religion was more kind of an academic piece, is like almost like a pre-PhD thing. So I said, well, let's definitely do the 3-year thing. And as part of that, they have you do an internship, and I did an internship with the Lutheran Campus Ministry at campus at the university that I was attached to, and super love that as a viable faith community. It kind of helped bridge between like what I had grown up with and what I could kind of see myself doing, later on in life. It was like, oh, this could really work. So that was really encouraging. So after I graduated from divinity school, I went to this other small town in Massachusetts and working again as a teacher and a swim coach and a dorm parent. And a little teeny part of my job description said something like assistant chaplain, which they had Sunday evening meetings, and we were supposed to do something interesting for the kids who didn't totally want to be there. So that was really exciting as part of my job. And so, again, I kind of did this out of order. In between my 2 years at that second school, I applied for something that's called clinical pastoral education. which basically was an 11-week internship at an inner city hospital in Chicago. And so there were like 4 or 5 of us chaplains. And so we would have particular units that we would cover. And I covered like the OB/GYN unit, and also like pediatric oncology. So those were the things. And then we took turns rotating, doing like overnight, 24-hour shifts, kind of in emergency room and stuff like that. So
Wow.
I would say the biggest kind of most confirming thing was that summer working in the hospital, which was, total inner city South Side Chicago, like, well, you're from the Midwest. um, so um, that experience of both being deeply engaged by or touched by what I was doing, and also kind of on the edge of my seat all the time spiritually, like I was always in over my head, but then I kind of would trust in God and the Holy Spirit to like be present in my weakness or my lack or my finitude and everything. And so that, I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like, I mean, it's terrible to compare it to like a drug, but like once you're living in that all the time, it's really hard to imagine not doing that. So that kind of, um, that definitely, like when I came back from that was when I started up the um, ordination process again. And that definitely, I mean, you can see that along the way, they were kind of like nudging into, or little turns into exploring more intentional, um, you know, ministry. And yet definitely that experience, I would say, was kind of the um, crystallizing one. Like, yeah, I can't just, I mean, I love teaching, I love coaching, but this was a different dimension of that.
Oh
So,
yeah.
yeah.
When you're in the hospital with those folks, what is the job of a chaplain?
Oh, that's a
I
great question.
know.
Um, so the kind of the official way to say it is to be a non-anxious presence, to kind of go wherever people want to go. And I can give you some examples. The kind of unofficial thing is to say we loiter purposefully. So, I mean, what that would look like is, it's basically building relationship, collaborative relationship with like the nurses, the social workers, the art therapists, the unit secretaries, like, and partly it's because, so you want to be in the flow of information, and partly it's because they are people whose jobs are really challenging and who carry the, spiritual burden of their work. And so you want to be attentive to that. But then there's also that it's almost like trust builds on trust. So like if you form a good relationship with those folks, they will know whom to call when, the patient in 23B is having a really hard time, or if it's, with kids, like their parents are freaking out. So like you never, so it's basically kind of joining in with definitely chaplaincy wants people to form team kind of relationships in a medical community.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of a context. But what it would entail, like, I would say there's kind of two things. One is like purposefully, making rounds and introducing yourself and like knock on the door. And if people are receptive, introduce yourself and kind of, I'm the chaplain. And, you don't necessarily, the kind of ethics of chaplaincy are, you don't necessarily project one's own faith onto somebody else, but you're kind of like receptive, and like if somebody's it's like, hey, is there anything else before I go? They'd be like, oh, we'd love to have a prayer, or you might say, hey, before I head out, would you like to have a prayer? And one of the things in inner city Chicago was you had no clue what people's faith tradition might be. Um, might be very different from Christian. Um, so that's one thing, is to kind of, it's a little extroverty for me, but um, but that's one thing, is to kind of go out. And the other is when we carried beepers when we were on duty, so that could go off anytime, day or night, and you like maybe literally had no idea what you were walking into. So a
Wow.
lot of times we got called to the emergency room in the afternoon for people who had various, it was a trauma center, so with various types of injuries or whatever. And um I mean, that the short version is that was an unbelievable summer. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
encountered things that I never in my life would have thought I would have encountered. And um that was just wow. Yeah.
How do you handle all that emotionally, being there for all that?
Yeah, so I'll just briefly say that after that internship, and I got another, like, it was a residency, at a 9-month residency at a hospital in Washington D.C. And then after that I worked as a hospice chaplain for like 5 years. So um I think the thing that chaplaincy really, really, really teaches you is to be kind of constantly taking a little like barometer of your own emotional, spiritual um, attentiveness or presence or energy level, and to be authentic about it. Like, um, just like, let's say like you and I had been having a super intense conversation for like an hour or something, like, and I might be like really hungry because I hadn't had lunch yet or something, or I might be just like beat because I'd been up all night, you know, or I might be really anxious, like, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to get home because Christy said she wanted me to put the dinner in the oven, like whatever. But to be open about that and then kind of make really super conscious decisions about that. It might be like, all right, I recognize I'm tired and hungry, but I can be present with you for another half an hour or something like that. Or, I can be saying, hey, I really appreciate our conversation, but could we come back to it again tomorrow? I've got something I need to take care of. And just to be kind of honest or in touch with oneself, and tend to that in the context of a conversation or a pastoral relationship, so that the worst thing you could do is like pretend to be present when really your mind and heart are somewhere else. I mean, that's not the worst thing, but like that,
Uh-huh.
because you're really not present.
Mm-hmm.
And so they really, like, I don't want to say beat it into you, but they really underscore, like, you have to be authentic with yourself, otherwise you're not authentic with the person.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of handling it emotionally, like, um I mean, we part of the training programs are that we kind of talked about the experiences that we had, and so we could have a lot of peer support. Um, certainly having, um, and this kind of continues, up to now, like, um, being able to talk openly with Christy about what I'm experiencing, or we have the pastor parish relations board at the church to be able to touch base with them. Um, it and then the other thing I think is the kind of spiritual freedom. And I remember this one time, um, I was like, all right, it's kind of like 4:20. I can either make one more visit to the hospital. This is 20 years ago, or I can go home because I'm really concerned because Christy wasn't feeling well or something like that. I'm like, I'm gonna choose to go home right now. Like, I can always overwork, but
Yeah.
this is important. And I think, um, I mean, I refer to it as spiritual freedom because I think that's what it is.
Mm.
Like, and there's another little piece of that too that has to do with faith, which is, um, this chaplains would say to themselves a lot, and ministers too, like, just because I'm not there doesn't mean God is not present. Like, we have to have a faith in God who transcends personal limitations,
Mm.
and God's at work even when I'm not.
Yeah.
So that becomes an exercise in trust and an exercise in faith. Um, so I mean, that's how I'd kind of answer that is,
Yeah.
um, it doesn't all boil down to self-care. I mean, that's a piece of it, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it starts with the kind of awareness, um, of, what am I feeling? What do these feelings lead me to do in terms of the decisions I need to make to be present right now? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, you were saying that sometimes you're when you're doing the chaplain work or you're with somebody who isn't Christian, that maybe they have a different faith or
Yep.
they don't know faith. How do you are they receptive or how do you talk to them? How does that
You know,
go?
honestly, it's like, um, I mean, like across every line of difference, there's been both kind of rejection, disinterest, and total enthusiasm. Like, it's really funny. And almost every time I'm like, oh my gosh, there's the Holy Spirit. Like every time there's a connection, I'm like, there was one time where like I was visiting this woman in DC and she was in the hospital and I said, oh, I'm Rob. And she's like, oh, what church are you from? I said, oh, the United Church of Christ. She's like, oh, that's great. I'm the Assemblies of God. I'm like, we could not be more different, you know, feel if you mapped out
Uh-huh.
theologically, socially, whatever. And yet she was in a receptive place. And, I'm not there to be like, oh, I think you should be UCC. I'm like, well, tell me about your faith, tell me about your church, or, what's your pastor like? And um, I think when people go into it with a curious, well, let's say there was somebody who had passed and their family had like, I'm not even sure what their faith was. Um, but they kind of encourage you. And, I'm a little bit shy sometimes. So um, I, I sometimes forget this, but they try to encourage you, like, hey, just ask. Like, so this person died, and like, well, we should say some prayers. So, well, what, then a good thing for a chaplain to say would be something like, well, tell me what that would look like in your tradition, and it kind of like, as long as you're honoring where they are, they feel cared for by a holy person or a person who brings grace with them. Um,
Mm.
or, if that feels too weird, you can be like, hey, this is what I would do. What would you suggest? So there's kind of um, it kind of gives them the freedom and authenticity to kind of claim what's going to work for them. And so I'd say, even people who might be agnostic or atheist or whatever, like whatever their flavor is, checking in with people kind of honors where they are, and they can kind of, help steer the boat a little bit.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so I mean, well, and then the other thing is, if you knock on the door, you so and so, hi, I'm Rob, I'm the chaplain. They say, I'm not really interested. Okay, thanks. Would you like me to stop by tomorrow? And they can say, no, we're good. Or they say,
Mm.
yeah, sure, that'd be fine. So I think, again, if it's kind of constantly affirming their self-determination, especially in
Mm.
a time of illness or diminishment, like that kind of gives them, we're like, okay, I can't tell the person to not come in and take my blood pressure, but I can tell the chaplain not to visit. And that's pretty cool. So
Yeah.
you're trying to build up a little base of, strength and encouragement,
Yeah.
even if it looks like rejection. So
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
um,
Yeah.
I will say, this is really interesting. And I don't know if I could point to this. There may be an article in case you'd be interested. This is far away from the main, but when I worked for a hospice, they used to present, so hospice is largely funded by Medicare, and part of it is they expect to be able to offer chaplaincy services. How those are presented can vary really widely. Um, one, for a while, the organization that used to work for a hospice would say something like, we have a chaplain, and if you're interested, let us know, and we'll put you in touch, kind of thing. And their response rate was about like 20%. People like, oh, I got my own pastor, or blah, blah, blah. Like there was a lot of, and chaplains represent death for them,
Mm.
so like, no, 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 I don't want anybody to read me the last rites yet, kind of thing. When started presenting it differently, they said something like, like a social worker, a chaplain's part of our hospice interdisciplinary team, and you can expect a call within the next 3 or 4 days. And the reception rate went up to like 80%, 85%.
Wow.
So yeah, it's really interesting how that all um, was framed. So anyway, that's just
Yeah.
kind of a little curious sidelight.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, wow, that's neat. That's neat.
yeah.
Do you think there is a difference between a job and like a calling? a calling from
Mm.
God?
Hmm. I do. Um, they can overlap. So the first thing I want to say about call is I don't understand it to be kind of like a once and done thing. Like, I get a call when I'm 15 and like that's going to be my life. Um, there's a really good book called um, The Call to the Soul by Marjorie Bankson. And
Oh.
it talks about kind of a cyclical nature of call that like when we're in tune with our spiritual discernment, we can kind of measure, we can take stock of our kind of spiritual energy for a particular expression of call. And we can notice like when that energy is building and when the energy is kind of diminishing. Um, so my probably most powerful experience of that was when I was finishing up with the Seacoast Mission, like, oh gosh, almost exactly 7 years ago. Um, and I was feeling kind of, I mean, I hesitate to say burned out, but I kind of was feeling like I had done what I could do, and I'd been doing it for 12 years. Um, and kind of along the same lines, I knew that Bar Harbor Congregational Church was looking for a full-time pastor, and unexpectedly, honestly, I did not anticipate this. I started getting a lot of energy and ideas around that. I'm like, like this is something, and it took about a year for it all to kind of unfold with all the process, but um, that was really intriguing to me to feel kind of on this spiritual level, a sense of calling to calling away from or a letting go and a calling toward. Um, so, I mean, in some ways that represents the call as a job, but I mean, people have so many different, to me, call and identity are not the same. Like, um, and that's, I think, maybe where I have a little bit of like a danger or worry that people identify completely with a particular call, but that's only a part of their life story, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I might say that when you kind of say a call on a job, I certainly think people can feel called to doing a particular thing in a particular place and time. And I feel like sometimes it's really important for people to just try something because I don't think like waiting like in the desert for a lightning bolt kind of
Oh.
is necessarily a place of discernment. I think, um, I've mentioned this to Peter and Jacob, like sometimes trying something and finding out you hate it is really helpful information.
Yeah.
Um, so you might think, oh, I super totally want to be a blah, blah, blah. And you try it and you're like, nope. And that is great. It stinks,
Yeah.
but it's great. So I don't know. It's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah, I guess I just get concerned that people link call and identity, and then that fixes both things, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because like even, I mean, I do feel like there is a call to parenthood, and and that in some ways that's a permanent feature of my life, and at the same time, it can't be my only identity.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
that kind of I don't know. There's some Venn diagram, I bet, of like call. I should find it for you. There's a Japanese term like ikagai, Ikagai, I think, and it has a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
these Venn diagrams of like what you're good at, what you can get paid for, what makes you joyful, and something else. And like there's this mushing of these Venn diagrams. It's really, really, really good, and it answers that, or it engages that question.
Oh, that's cool. That's
If I can
cool.
find it, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like how you talk about like
Those
energy as
Venn.
an indicator
Oh,
for where. I think you froze for a minute, or I froze,
oh dear. Okay.
but it's all good now.
Okay, we're
Um,
good.
I like how you talk about energy as an indicator for what your calling might be. Like that.
I think it's important because I guess I should say I don't feel like call is intended for us to be miserable.
Uh-huh.
Like, if people frame call as kind of like a response of duty to faith and then relation, and I mean, I think I really resonate with Frederick Buechner, who said that, call or vocation is a place where um, our deep gladness meets the world's deep need.
Oh.
And I'm like, yeah, that's it. Because not that any particular job or role we have is always without difficulty or work or anything like that, but like I think the intent is that deep gladness, and maybe also I would say where Parker Palmer calls it calls it the congruence between role and soul.
Mm.
And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. I don't think, I'm not meant to be a chef, I like
Yeah.
cooking, but that's not, I don't think that would bring out the best of me.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another question. So you are a great prayer writer and speaker. I don't know if there is an answer for this, but where do your prayers come from, or how do you think of them?
Hmm. Um, Thank you, first of all. That means a lot. Um, so the prayers that I might speak extemporaneously that I haven't written down at all, and I'll kind of peel the curtain back in a second and tell you why I do write down a lot of them. The prayers that I don't write down. I mean, I just have been praying out loud since like high school, and I sometimes, like anybody, I jumble my words and get lost, and phrases don't fit together. But I try and I totally try not to be consumed with, self consciousness around that, um, and just try to be authentic about what I'm hearing. And so, like, let's say you and I just had a pastoral visit or something, and it felt appropriate to kind of encapsulate it in prayer. Then, I might pick up on some threads of our conversation and, kind of raise them up to the presence and grace of God. If you're about to go on a road trip or something, just kind of give it a context, so as opposed to a generality. Um, the prayers that I would write down, so when we have the pastoral prayer at part of our worship service, um, I would generally say when I was working out on the islands, I would generally not have very much written down. Um, People would say, and I invite people to say, "Oh, who are you praying for?" And they kind of, say what's going on, and then I kind of try to tie it together a little bit. But I've chosen to write the prayers down in our church because there's like 4 or 5 people to whom I send an email version of our service, like Sunday morning. So
Uh-huh.
it has the text of the pastoral prayer and it has the text of the sermon, and largely because they're hard of hearing. So even with all our augmentation of hearing, they might not get it. Or if they're there in the sanctuary, they can kind of follow along. So kind
Yeah.
of connect the pieces. Um, it feels a little more formal, and a little less immediate than the kind of extemporaneous prayer, but I kind of feel like it. I would rather go that route and include them than, kind of go the other way. So, um, and the other, I mean, this isn't quite answering your question, but the other thing I'm conscious of is, in many churches, and we've kind of sculpted our worship to kind of avoid this a little bit, but in many churches, people, like if we say, "Oh, share your joys and concerns," and we get the collection of 8 or 10 joys or concerns. In many churches, the pastor will repeat those,
Mm.
We pray for Susie, who's blah, blah, blah. Um, I want to frame it so that the people who are offering their joys and concerns are already praying. So I don't want it to be like I have to package it in a way that God will hear it.
Mm.
So that kind of leads me to write prayers that are more general as opposed to, and again, less extemporaneous. Um, and it's partly because I'm trying to thread that needle of wanting to be, um, accessible and, spiritually, emotionally kind of grounded in the set of relationships that this time represents, but not wanting to restate something that somebody else said as a prayer. So that's where I kind of like, it's almost like a half a step back to kind of pray more generally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do kind of follow somewhat of a pattern, expressing gratitude to try to, dust off our souls a little bit, open with gratitude, be mindful of our needs and the people of those that we know, more intimately. Um, be mindful of the needs of people we don't know as well, the people who are suffering and our social and kind of worldwide connection. So there's kind of a little bit of a flow, but sometimes I get a little worried that it might sound redundant from one week to the next, or but hopefully it doesn't too much. So,
For sure. Yeah,
yeah.
that was one of my favorite things about going to church for the first time in Bar Harbor. The how everybody or like you ask if there's any prayers that the congregation wants to share. I've never seen that happen in my life in any other church,
Oh
and it
wow.
just made everybody feel so like you get to know people that way, and
Yeah, yeah.
it was really cool.
That's really complex sociologically to me because like it's not the case that everybody knows each other,
Hmm.
and so sometimes like when it's lots of summer people and nobody knows anybody kind of, people can be really verbose because they're like, heck, I'm never going to see these people again, right?
Yeah.
And or everyone's really, I mean, anxious, or if they have to know people, and like if you're new, do you say your prayer or do you not? Like it's so tricky. um yeah, that's just the hope is that it builds up that sort of kind of safe intimacy, spiritual fellowship that you know um, it's a place of real kind of heart soul connection.
Yeah, for sure. Another question.
You have great questions, by the way. This is really good.
Thank you. Okay, so this question. So we have this statement, you have the statement on this website about us being an open and affirming church. Hi there, it's me, but I'm editing. I'm interrupting to actually read this statement to you because I feel like you just won't have context unless I do, unless you already know it. So here it is. Jesus teaches us to welcome all God's children into God's covenantal community. All people are created in God's image and thus are loved by God. Love is the unifying and strengthening force within the Christian faith. We recognize that within this church we possess different perspectives and interpretations of Scripture. We celebrate that diversity and seek to honor it. We, the members of the Bar Harbor Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, hereby declare ourselves to be an open and affirming Christian community within the United Church of Christ, actively expressing Jesus' inclusive embrace of all people. We welcome those who seek to follow Jesus, including persons of every age, gender, race, national origin, faith background, marital status and family structure, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, mental and physical ability, economic and social status, and educational background to share in the life, leadership, employment, ministry, fellowship, worship, sacraments, rights, responsibilities, blessings, and joys of our church family. As we grow together in faith and love, let us strive to celebrate the diversity in which God has created us. All right, back to the interview. And when I was doing my church shopping my first year in Maine, I was looking around and I came across that and I thought, this is really interesting. What does this mean? Like, I love this. This is so beautiful. Because I kind of didn't know, I'd never like been a part of church that felt like my church, like my place. So I didn't know if you could just kind of walk in or how that went. Like, I know you can, but
Yeah.
at the time I wasn't sure. And so that little statement made me think, that's where I'll go this Sunday. I'll try this. And I read that statement now and I really appreciate it. And I think it's so inclusive and beautiful. And I think that some people would look at that and think that maybe there's some political ideas to it. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm wondering how that statement has been received by people, if there's any controversy or like people feeling like it is political, or if it's all been good responses, or where that statement came from, how it's been going.
There's actually a pretty good history of it. The UCC, I don't know the dates. The United Church of Christ as a denomination is an open and affirming denomination. And what they mean by that specifically is to be receptive and honoring of the ministries of people who are gay and lesbian. Well, LGBTQ plus. I mean the whole gamut now.
Right.
But originally gay and lesbian. So there's been some, and they were among the first denominations to have that be kind of part of their identity. Probably 30 years ago or something like that now. Maybe more. So they've been encouraging. So this is so tricky. The UCC as a denomination is in voluntary covenant with each of the member churches. So the UCC could say, they could say whatever they want about open and affirming, and none of the congregations are obligated to follow that. It's not a top-down policy. But certainly for a variety of reasons, most of them, good integrity reasons, a little bit of them having to do with marketing. The UCC wanted to encourage local churches to adopt open and affirming statements. And partly, I think of this in a larger urban context, like if there's 15 churches, in a 1 mile radius, like, oh, cool, that's the open and affirming church, especially for people who find themselves marginalized around LGBTQ stuff. So I don't know when, but the Bar Harbor Congregational, actually, I think it was during the interim. Before I came, there were folks in the church who were both adamant against open and affirming because of what they thought was kind of a political correctness, pro-gay and lesbian thing, and people who left the church because our church wasn't moving quickly enough to adopt it. So, I mean, our church remains a fairly wide scope of ideology folks, which is really intriguing, to be honestly. Generally, I think we're kind of left of center, politically, theologically, etc. But it's not a homogeneous place at all. So the interim pastor before I came kind of thought it would be a good idea for the church to essentially adopt the open and affirming craft and adopt the open and affirming statement before I came, so I didn't have to deal with it, which is not a bad idea. They had a bunch of focus groups and meetings and things like this. When it passed, it actually passed like my second Sunday. It was kind of a mess, but whatever, it's all fine. Or maybe my third. When it passed like with an 87%, majority for. People expressed, of the rational concerns that people expressed, they were worried that it signaled us becoming an activist church, and I'm not really sure what they meant or what their fears were about that. we so there's two other parts of it. And to be honest, we were the last UCC church on MDI to become open and affirming. So, I mean, yeah. I don't, there have been 3 or 4 times when the open and affirming statement has been a guideline for us making decisions about different parts of our like building use, for example. So one of the ones that I remember is that the Boy Scouts had left our church to go to the Baptist church. I don't have any idea why. But maybe my first or second year, they were interested in coming back. And at the time, I forget the order of this, but the Boy Scouts were receptive of scouts who were gay, but not of leaders who were gay. And so they weren't kind of a fit, like some people could say, well, by our open and affirming statement, we can't be in relationship with them because they're not fully where we might hope for them to be. And other people, and this has been true when we hosted the Buddhist prayer meditation group for a while, and the Quaker group, like other people kind of interpreted and said, you know, open and affirming means we are living our life in relationship with others where they are, you know, relationships of integrity and, you know, wholeness. And we can hope that the scouts might move, you know, to a different place, but we're willing to be in relationship with them. And so it's been interesting that the open and affirming statement has been kind of this regrounding for us in challenging us to be more accepting. Not only about LGBTQ, but also about other, you know, engaging with people of other faiths and having our space available, you know, things like that. So that has been an interesting application of open and affirming. So it kind of like pulls us both directions in a way, you know. I don't think we would, if a group were inherently exclusive, I don't know that we would, you know, we wouldn't support that. That we couldn't play that game. But so that's how it's been used. You might notice we do not display a rainbow flag. And a lot of churches that are open and affirming do. Our church council talked about it probably about 3 or 4 years ago, because there was some folks in the church who were very, 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 very adamant for us to have a rainbow flag. And our conversation, I thought, was a good one. And we said, you know, it is a polarizing symbol, and while it would certainly be kind of a, you know, like a fish in the ground, you know, it would be a welcoming symbol for some people. It would also be an exclusive symbol for others. So what we started to talk about, and that's when we started changing our church structure, and then we had the pandemic, so blah, blah, blah. To talk, and the other thing that I said I'm worried about is an ambivalent symbol like that, people project meaning on it, and we lose the ability to control the message. I am in favor of, I mean, if we had a rainbow flag, let's have text on it, and it might say, you know, free the imprisoned, or release the bound, and, you know, honor all people. I mean, we, you know, imagine there are 7 colors and we gave text to each one, you know. That would, and maybe we could all agree on a text, you know. And that to me would be a way to kind of, I don't want to say control the narrative, but be more specific about what messages. And so we did have a graphic artist kind of work with us a little bit, and we have a banner, and I don't know, next time you're in the church, check out, like, in my office. We just have a draft, and it says "We are one," and in rainbow lettering. So the rainbow is super subtle, but it kind of highlights, to me, it kind of references the second part of that song like "We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord"? Do you know that song?
I don't, but I
Oh
love
my gosh.
it.
Yeah, we are one in the Spirit. We are one. Oh, they'll know we are Christians by our love. That's the song.
Oh, I love that song. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
like, so it kind of, we wanted it. It kind of had both a theological and like and a well, it had a theological dimension to it. It wasn't just kind of a planting our flag on a kind of an ideological or political place. So, but we still have kind of a whole set of conversations that we haven't had around because we're about to do it and then we got pandemic. But
Hmm.
how can we represent who we are better to the people who are walking by in the street?
Hmm.
And again, it kind of goes to the what information can we share that speaks about our values, our activities, um, and not in this kind of polarizing or ambivalent symbol.
Hmm.
But anyway, so I mean, it's truthfully, it's a bit of a balancing act. It'd be really
Yeah.
easy to just put a flag up. Intriguingly, neither of the other two UCC churches displays a rainbow flag either. So it's
Hmm.
kind of funny, like that you could certainly make a case that both of them are more progressive than we are, and yet that hasn't been their mode of expression either. So it's really kind of it's delicate enough to want to honor the. I mean, there are some people in our church who don't support um, the ministries and the lifestyles, as they would call it, of
Hmm.
gay and lesbian people on a theological basis, um, and yet their perceptions or understandings don't shape or limit our church's ministries in any way.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
And it doesn't make them feel like they can't be a part of the church too.
um, mostly yes. I mean,
Okay.
have some people who are super active before I came are not as active,
Hmm.
and that may be um, a reason.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a little hard to trace.
Yeah, that's tricky. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
That's very interesting. That's cool to hear. I like the idea of the text on there to.
Yeah. I mean that the people who really wanted the rainbow flag didn't super love that idea because they just wanted the rainbow flag. But
Hmm.
I thought what a neat opportunity if we had 6 lines. What are the 6 things we would say about our spiritual theological values?
Hmm.
Um, in 5 words or less on each line.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought that would be a really intriguing exercise to go through. Um, and I would say different from, there are, we had some examples of little posters, like one of them, like, obviously one these days would be Black Lives Matter, another would be like Science is Real, Believe Women. Like there's all these different kind of important cultural slogans. Um, the question is, to what extent would those be reflective of our kind of theological values?
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
don't know. Like, I mean, I got my list, but or somewhere, I think I've lost it. But
Hmm.
I can't speak for the church, so it would be, like I said, it'd be an um, interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. Well, I have one more question,
Okay.
and it is I've been thinking a lot about miracles lately within my
Mm.
senior project, reading books, reading the
Mm.
Bible. And I mean, of course, like Jesus feeding a bunch of people with a couple loaves of bread, huge miracle, defies the laws of, the natural world, as
Mm.
we'd see in science. Marianne Williamson has this quote where she says that a miracle happens anytime there's a shift in perception from fear to love. So
Wow.
I know there's all these different kinds of definitions, but I'm wondering if you believe in miracles and what is your definition of a miracle?
Oh my gosh, that's a big
It's a
question.
big question, I know.
Mm. I awfully like what she has to say. I think that's phenomenal because my concern is um, that people read the Bible miracles and think that miracles only happened then, and
Mm-hmm.
that like now with a modern scientific worldview, they're impossible, kind of. And I'm like, no, so for me, it feels like miracles um, in the Bible are meant to get us thinking about what it looks like today, you know. Um, and I also think about both miracles and healing stories. Like the purpose is to restore, either to build community, to restore to community, and like so. Then I remember the first open table 3 years ago. It was a blizzard, like, and they had 40 people show up, like, and it was blizzard, not like wimpy snow. Um, and I was thinking, like, well, that's a miracle that anybody showed up, right? And we didn't feed 5,000, but we fed 40, and I kind of feel like that's a miracle, like that counts, because to me, like I go back to the purpose, like it ends alienation and suspicion and all of our isolation. It calls us together. It forces us to share something larger than ourselves. And like that's how I see God at work. And so if I see God at work, that's like a miracle. And I guess I don't want to like hold out like miracles only count if they're like big and defy the laws of physics and medicine kind of thing. Like I feel like my gratitude can be sparked by something a lot more simple. And that to me, that's an awareness that I want to kind of cultivate, not just like, only if I jump off the bridge and fly will it be a miracle. Like, yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's the way I see it, I guess.
Yeah. I loved that. I love that you used Open Table as an example, because the first time I went to Open Table, and actually probably every time when it was actually happening in the building, it absolutely felt like a miracle. I think I'd never experienced that type of community ever before Open Table. There's just so much love in the music and talking to new people and this beautiful free meal. I absolutely feel like that's a miracle. Yeah.
And now, like there's so many devoted people who make it happen all the time. There's so many people who have the resources to fund it. Like I mean, 3.5 years ago, you said to Mahandeva, you're going to be feeding 360 people in a pandemic, delivering, and then, delivering another 150 every weekend. He would have been like, you're nuts. Like, no way. So, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. And I guess too, like, there've been so many people going through surgery lately. Like, I think it's incredible that people have the knowledge, the wisdom, the skill to bring healing to people. And I know that not everybody can be helped in that way, but like the fact that it happens at all is pretty cool. So I don't know. That's kind of where I guess it's like, I don't want to hold out and be like, well, it's only going to count if like the person should have died, but they didn't. I'm like, no, the person could have died and they didn't, and that's pretty amazing. So,
yeah. All healing. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, that is all my questions. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. We can talk forever.
You've been listening to Glue, a project in conversational Christianity. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Rob, so much for talking to me.